Marinci padaju na testu u Zadru, čistačica posudi pušku I ponizi sve. The August sun blazed mercilessly over Zadar's military training grounds, where the Croatian army had gathered for what was supposed to be a showcase of international cooperation. A visiting unit of foreign Marines had arrived to demonstrate their marksmanship skills, and the local media buzzed with anticipation. Camera crews positioned themselves strategically around the shooting range, their lenses capturing every detail of the crisp uniforms and polished equipment. The coastal breeze carried the scent of salt and gunpowder, mixing with the nervous energy that hung in the air like morning mist over the Adriatic. Among the crowd of officials, journalists, and curious onlookers, nobody paid attention to the small figure in a faded blue cleaning uniform who quietly swept the concrete paths between the barracks. Mira Kovacevic moved like a shadow, her weathered hands gripping the broom handle with the same precision a soldier might hold a rifle. At 52, she had been cleaning these same floors for over a decade, invisible to most who passed by. Her grey hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her worn sneakers made no sound as she worked. To the Marines and officers preparing for their demonstration, she was just part of the background, another piece of the military machinery that kept things running smoothly. Captain Tomislav Juric stepped forward to address the assembled crowd, his chest puffed with national pride. "Today our Croatian forces will witness the precision and skill of our international allies," he announced in heavily accented English, gesturing toward the visiting Marines who stood at attention in perfect formation. The foreign unit's commander, a tall man with steel-grey eyes and a jaw that could cut glass, nodded curtly as cameras flashed around him. The Croatian media representatives scribbled notes frantically, already crafting headlines about military cooperation and national strength. Behind them, Mira continued her work, pausing only to empty her dustpan near the equipment storage area. She watched the proceedings with quiet eyes that seemed to hold secrets nobody cared to discover. The Marines began their weapons inspection, each movement calculated and rehearsed for maximum visual impact. Their rifles gleamed in the sunlight, and their confidence radiated through the ranks like heat waves rising from the asphalt. One young Marine cracked a joke about the Balkan heat making the targets dance, earning chuckles from his comrades. The Croatian officers forced polite smiles, though some frowned at the casual arrogance in the foreigner's voice. "As soon as this incredible story unfolds, tell us, which country are you watching from? Leave a comment and hit the like button so this video reaches even more people. Subscribe to the channel. You can't miss tomorrow's story." And now, let's continue. The first Marine stepped up to the firing line, his movements fluid and confident as he shouldered his rifle. The range officer called out the standard commands in Croatian, then repeated them in English for the visitor's benefit. "Spremni, ready, Chilj, aim, pali, fire." The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the training ground, and all eyes turned to the distant target. A red flag waved from the scoring booth, a complete miss. The Marine's face flushed red beneath his helmet, but he maintained his military bearing as he stepped aside for the next shooter. Murmurs rippled through the Croatian contingent, though they kept their expressions diplomatically neutral. The second Marine took his position with even more deliberation, adjusting his stance multiple times before settling into his shooting position. His shot rang out with authority, but again the red flag signaled another miss. The foreign commander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, while some of the Croatian soldiers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Mira had stopped sweeping entirely now, leaning on her broom handle as she observed the proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who understood what she was witnessing. The third Marine's shot went wide, striking somewhere in the dirt berm behind the target array. By now the confident chatter among the visiting unit had died to uncomfortable silence, and their commanding officer stood rigid as a statue, his hands clasped behind his back. The Croatian media representatives looked puzzled, unsure whether to continue filming what was becoming an embarrassing display rather than the impressive demonstration they had expected. Captain Juric cleared his throat nervously, his earlier pride now replaced with second-hand embarrassment for his guests. "Perhaps the unfamiliar conditions," he began diplomatically, but the foreign commander cut him off with a sharp gesture. "My men are trained for all conditions," he stated flatly, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. The fourth Marine stepped up with grim determination, taking extra time to adjust his sights and check his breathing. His shot was closer, but still missed the target completely, sending a puff of dust up from the hillside beyond. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of waves against Zadar's ancient stone walls. Even Mira's broom had stopped moving as she watched the unfolding disaster, with eyes that seemed to hold some hidden knowledge. 5 more Marines took their turns, each miss more embarrassing than the last. What had started as a confident demonstration of international military prowess had devolved into a series of failures that left everyone present feeling uncomfortable. The visiting commander's face had turned the color of old leather, while his men shuffled their feet and avoided eye contact with their Croatian hosts. The media crews had stopped filming actively, though their cameras remained pointed at the range in case something salvageable emerged from the debacle. Captain Juric was running out of diplomatic phrases, his forced smile becoming more strained with each failed shot. In the scoring booth, the Croatian range officer continued to wave his red flag with mechanical precision, though his expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else. The August heat seemed to press down on everyone with renewed intensity, making uniforms stick to sweaty skin and tempers grow shorter. One of the younger Croatian soldiers whispered something to his companion in rapid Croatian, earning a sharp look from his sergeant. The foreign Marines had given up their earlier jokes about local conditions, now standing in sullen silence as their reputation crumbled with each missed shot. Through it all, Mira continued to watch with the patience of someone who had seen enough military operations to know that skill couldn't be faked, regardless of how polished the equipment or confident the bearing. The last Marine in the lineup, a heavily muscled man with sergeant's stripes, approached the firing line with the swagger of someone determined to salvage his unit's reputation. He made a show of checking his rifle thoroughly, adjusting every possible setting, and taking an exaggerated shooting stance that looked more suited to a Hollywood movie than an actual military exercise. The Croatian observers watched with barely concealed skepticism as he went through his elaborate pre-firing ritual, clearly overcompensating for his comrades' failures. When he finally squeezed the trigger, the shot rang out with particular authority, and for a moment everyone held their breath waiting for the scoring flag. Red again, not just a miss, but a wild shot that hadn't even come close to the target area. The sergeant's face went through several colors before settling on an unhealthy purple, and he stormed away from the firing line without bothering to clear his weapon properly. The foreign commander looked as though he had swallowed something particularly bitter, while his men stared at their boots with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts. Captain Juric made another attempt at diplomacy, suggesting that perhaps the weapons needed calibration or that the local ammunition might be different from what the Marines were accustomed to. His words fell into the awkward silence like stones dropped into a deep well, making no appreciable impact on the situation. In the uncomfortable silence that followed, one of the younger Marines, perhaps trying to salvage some dignity through humor, gestured dismissively toward the Croatian weapons rack and let out a bitter laugh. "Maybe the problem isn't the conditions," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe it's the equipment. These old Soviet-era rifles probably couldn't hit the broadside of a barn." His comment drew sharp looks from the Croatian officers, though military protocol prevented them from responding directly to a foreign guest's insult. The visiting commander shot his subordinate a look that could have melted steel, but the damage was already done. The suggestion that Croatian military equipment was inferior hung in the air like smoke from a poorly maintained engine, adding insult to the injury of their failed demonstration. Captain Juric's diplomatic smile finally cracked, replaced by the tight expression of a man holding his temper in check through sheer force of will. The Croatian soldiers' faces had gone cold as winter wind off the Adriatic, their earlier attempts at hospitality replaced by barely concealed offense. Even the media representatives sensed the shift in atmosphere, some stepping back as though expecting the situation to escalate beyond their ability to report it safely. The Marine who had made the comment seemed to realize his mistake too late, his face flushing as he understood he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It was in this moment of maximum tension that something unexpected happened. Mira Kovacevic, who had been quietly observing from the periphery, stepped forward into the circle of military personnel and media crews. Her movement was so sudden and out of place that conversation stopped mid-sentence, leaving everyone staring at the small woman in her faded cleaning uniform. She approached the weapons rack with the confidence of someone who belonged there, though her presence among the military personnel was as jarring as a sparrow landing among eagles. "Excuse me," she said in accented but clear English, her voice carrying farther than her small stature would suggest. The foreign Marines looked at her with a mixture of confusion and barely concealed amusement. Here was someone even more out of place than they felt in their moment of professional embarrassment. One of them actually chuckled, a sound that carried more arrogance than humor. "What's this?" the sergeant who had missed his shot asked in a voice dripping with condescension. "The cleaning lady wants to give us shooting lessons?" His comment drew nervous laughter from some of his comrades, though the Croatian personnel watched with expressions ranging from confusion to growing concern about where this unexpected development might lead. Mira's weathered hands reached for one of the rifles, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their precision. She lifted the weapon with a familiarity that immediately changed the dynamic in the group, though most of the observers were too surprised to fully process what they were seeing. The rifle that had seemed heavy and unwieldy in the hands of the trained Marines appeared to settle into her grip like it had found its proper home. She examined the weapon with quick, efficient movements, checking the action, testing the trigger pull, and running her fingers along the barrel with the expertise of someone who understood firearms at a level that went beyond basic training. The foreign commander's amusement began to fade as he watched her handle the rifle, replaced by a growing puzzlement that something wasn't quite right about this situation. Captain Juric stepped forward as though to intervene, but something in Mira's bearing stopped him mid-stride. She moved to the firing line with steps that carried no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the quiet confidence of someone who had done this many times before. The Marines' laughter died away as they watched her take her position, and even the media crews raised their cameras again, sensing that they might be about to witness something worth recording. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her grey hair as she shouldered the rifle, and for the first time since the demonstration began, the range fell into complete, expectant silence. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. Mira's entire bearing changed as she settled into her shooting stance. Her back straightened, her breathing became controlled and rhythmic, and her hands found their positions on the rifle with the muscle memory of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. She didn't take excessive time to aim or make a show of adjusting equipment. Instead, she simply raised the weapon, acquired her target, and in one smooth motion that seemed to last forever, and no time at all, squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the range with a different quality than the previous attempts, cleaner, more purposeful, like the sound a master craftsman's tool makes when used properly. Every eye turned toward the scoring booth, where the range officer stood frozen for a moment before slowly raising a white flag. Center mass. Perfect shot. The silence that followed was deeper than anything that had come before, a silence filled with the sound of assumptions crashing down and realities shifting into new configurations. The foreign Marines stared as though they had witnessed something impossible, while the Croatian personnel began to understand that they were seeing something far more significant than a lucky shot. Mira lowered the rifle with the same calm precision she had used to fire it, her expression unchanged as though hitting a bullseye was merely another part of her daily routine. A brief pause in our story. I want to ask you, what do you think about this? Write in the comments. Don't forget to hit the like button so this story reaches more people, and subscribe to the channel because tomorrow a new story awaits you. And now we continue. The white flag hanging in the still air seemed to mock everything the Marines thought they knew about marksmanship and military superiority. Sergeant Rodriguez, the heavily built Marine who had missed his shot so spectacularly, let out a snort that carried more disbelief than respect. "Lucky shot," he muttered, loud enough for his comrades to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if challenged. His comment rippled through the group of foreign soldiers like a stone thrown into calm water, generating nods and murmurs of agreement from men desperate to salvage their wounded pride. The Croatian officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing irritation with their guests' inability to accept what they had just witnessed. Captain Juric's diplomatic smile had been replaced by the tight-lipped expression of a man watching his hospitality being repaid with arrogance and denial. Mira heard the sergeant's comment, but showed no reaction, simply setting the rifle back in the rack with the same careful precision she had used to fire it. Her movements were deliberate and unhurried, like someone who had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than wounded egos, and defensive posturing. The morning sun climbed higher over Zadar's ancient walls, and the heat began to shimmer off the concrete firing line in waves that made the distant targets dance like mirages. As Mira turned to walk back to her cleaning duties, her weathered face carried the expression of someone who had just completed a routine task rather than achieved something remarkable. The foreign commander cleared his throat with the authority of someone accustomed to having his voice carry weight in any situation. "An interesting demonstration," he said in the carefully neutral tone that military officers used when they wanted to dismiss something without appearing openly hostile. "Though I think we can all agree that one shot hardly constitutes a proper evaluation of marksmanship skills." His words were directed at Captain Juric, but his eyes remained fixed on Mira as though she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The implication hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, that her perfect shot was somehow less meaningful than his men's consistent failures, that luck trumped skill when it didn't fit the expected narrative. Several of the Marines nodded in agreement, their body language radiating the kind of confidence that comes from refusing to acknowledge inconvenient truths. The Croatian media representatives had their cameras rolling again, sensing that the story was far from over and that they might be witnessing something more significant than a simple military demonstration gone wrong. Mira paused in her retreat, her hand still gripping the handle of her cleaning cart, and turned back toward the group with an expression that suggested she had understood every word of the commander's carefully veiled challenge. Her grey eyes, which had seemed unremarkable moments before, now held a glint that reminded several of the older Croatian veterans of something they couldn't quite place, but definitely recognized. "Perhaps you're right," Mira said in English that carried only the slightest trace of her Croatian accent, her voice cutting through the military posturing with the clarity of a bell in still air. "As we say in Croatia, one swallow does not make a spring." The translated idiom fell into the conversation with the weight of ancient wisdom, though most of the foreigners missed its significance entirely. She walked back toward the weapons rack with steps that seemed to echo louder than they should have on the concrete firing line. "Maybe I should try again, just to be sure it wasn't luck." Her words carried no challenge or aggression, just the simple statement of someone proposing a reasonable test of the claims being made around her. The Croatian soldiers watched with growing interest as their quiet cleaning lady transformed before their eyes into something else entirely, someone who understood the game being played and was prepared to play it by rules that favored skill over rank. Captain Juric found himself caught between diplomatic protocol and a growing curiosity about what exactly they were all about to witness. The foreign Marines exchanged glances that mixed amusement with growing unease, as though they sensed they were walking into a trap but couldn't quite identify where the danger lay. The morning breeze off the Adriatic carried the scent of salt and history, mixing with the smell of gun oil and military confidence that was beginning to show its first cracks. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward with the swagger of a man who had decided to take personal control of a situation that was slipping away from his unit's narrative. "Lady, I appreciate the gesture, but military marksmanship isn't something you pick up from watching movies or reading books," he said, with the patronizing tone reserved for civilians who didn't understand the complexities of real military training. His words drew chuckles from his fellow Marines, who seemed relieved to have someone willing to put this unexpected challenge back in its proper context. These weapons require years of training to master, and even then, hitting a target at this distance consistently requires physical conditioning and mental discipline that... His explanation trailed off as Mira selected another rifle from the rack, this one slightly different from the first, and began her inspection routine with movements that spoke of familiarity rather than curiosity. She worked through the weapon's mechanisms with an efficiency that suggested she wasn't learning the rifle's characteristics, she was confirming them. The sergeant's voice faltered as he watched her chamber around with the fluid motion of someone who had performed the action so many times it had become automatic. His fellow Marines' chuckles died away as they observed her handle the weapon with a competence that contradicted everything they had assumed about the small woman in the faded cleaning uniform. Even the Croatian officers were watching with new attention, as though seeing their longtime cleaning lady for the first time. The second shot rang out before most of the observers had fully processed that Mira had taken her firing position. Her movement from inspection to firing had been so smooth and rapid that it caught everyone off guard. including the range officer who barely had time to raise his spotting scope before the bullet found its mark. Another white flag, another perfect center hit, this one achieved with even less apparent effort than the first. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more charged with the electricity of expectations being systematically demolished. Sergeant Rodriguez's face went through several color changes before settling on an unhealthy shade of red that clashed with his camouflage uniform. "Lucky again," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction of his earlier dismissal, carrying instead the hollow ring of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Mira lowered the rifle and turned to face the assembled group with an expression that remained completely neutral, as though she were still just the cleaning lady who happened to be temporarily holding a military weapon. "2 swallows," she said simply, using the continuation of her earlier idiom in a way that made several of the Croatian veterans smile despite the tension. The foreign commander's jaw had set into the rigid line of someone whose worldview was being challenged by inconvenient facts, while his men shuffled their feet and avoided eye contact with their hosts. The media cameras captured every moment of the evolving drama, though the reporters weren't sure whether they were documenting military cooperation or watching it fall apart in real time. The third rifle Mira selected was an older model, one that had seen considerable use and whose action was less smooth than the newer weapons in the rack. She examined it with the same methodical care, though this time her inspection took slightly longer as she compensated for the weapon's individual characteristics and worn components. The Marines watched with growing unease as she made minor adjustments to the sights, her movements displaying a familiarity with firearm maintenance that contradicted their assumptions about her background and training. "That rifle's been giving us problems all morning," one of the Croatian soldiers mentioned quietly to his companion, speaking in Croatian but loud enough for several people to overhear. "The action sticks, and the trigger pull is heavy." His comment was intended as information, but it carried the unspoken implication that Mira was deliberately choosing a more difficult weapon to make her point. The foreign commander caught enough of the Croatian to understand the gist, and his expression grew even more grim as he realized that this wasn't getting easier for his men, it was getting harder. Mira's third shot cracked across the range with a different sound, the older rifle's report carrying a deeper note that spoke of years of faithful service despite its mechanical limitations. The white flag appeared again, this time accompanied by an audible gasp from one of the Marine corporals who had been maintaining that the whole demonstration was some kind of elaborate setup. 3 perfect shots with 3 different weapons, each hit achieved with the casual competence of someone for whom marksmanship was as natural as breathing. "You know what they say," Mira said as she returned the third rifle to its place in the rack, her voice carrying a hint of something that might have been amusement if anyone had been listening carefully enough to catch it. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The Croatian expression, translated literally into English, landed among the Marines like a cryptic puzzle they couldn't solve, though several of the Croatian personnel nodded in understanding. Her words suggested connections and inheritances that went beyond the immediate situation, hinting at depths that nobody had bothered to explore in the decade she had been cleaning their floors and emptying their trash cans. The foreign commander stepped forward with the determined air of someone who had decided to take direct control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage through subordinates. "This is impressive, certainly," he said, in the tone military officers used when they wanted to sound reasonable while preparing to assert authority. "But I think we need to understand what we're dealing with here. Are you suggesting that a civilian cleaning woman has somehow acquired marksmanship skills that exceed those of trained military personnel?" His question carried implications about proper order and expected hierarchies, about who belonged where in the careful structure of military society. Mira looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her 52 years, eyes that held memories of things the commander's careful military career had never required him to face. "I'm not suggesting anything," she replied quietly. "I'm just shooting where you point me." The young Marine who had earlier made the comment about Soviet-era equipment stepped forward with the aggressive confidence of someone who had decided that retreat was no longer an option. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but this is serious military business," he said, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose professional identity was being challenged by forces he didn't understand. "These are precision weapons that require specific training and certification to operate safely and effectively. His words drew nods from his fellow Marines, who seemed grateful to have someone articulate their growing frustration with a situation that made no sense according to their understanding of how the world worked. "I've been shooting competitively since I was 12 years old, trained at Quantico, qualified expert on every weapon system in our arsenal, and I'm telling you that what you just did is statistically impossible without years of specialized training." His voice rose with each word, drawing attention from across the entire training ground, as other personnel stopped their activities to observe the confrontation that was clearly building towards some kind of climax. Mira listened to his credentials with the patient attention of someone hearing a child recite a lesson they had memorized but didn't fully understand. "Statistically impossible," she repeated thoughtfully, as though testing the phrase for accuracy. "That's an interesting way to put it." She selected a fourth rifle from the rack, this one a sniper variant with a more complex scope system, and began her inspection routine while the young Marine continued to enumerate his qualifications and explain why her performance contradicted everything he knew about marksmanship training. The fourth shot was taken from a prone position that Mira assumed with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, her body settling into the shooting stance with the ease of someone returning to a familiar bed after a long journey. The scope adjustment took her less than 30 seconds, her hands finding the controls without hesitation despite the complexity of the system and the fact that different manufacturers placed controls in different locations. The shot, when it came, was followed by a silence so complete that the distant sound of traffic from Zadar's city center seemed to echo across the training ground like thunder. This time, the range officer didn't even bother to check his spotting scope before raising the white flag. He had been tracking her shots through his own optics and had watched the bullet strike the exact center of the target with precision that his instruments could barely measure. The foreign Marines stood in a cluster that had grown noticeably tighter as their collective confidence eroded shot by shot, their earlier swagger replaced by the defensive posture of people whose expertise was being systematically dismantled by someone they couldn't categorize or dismiss. Captain Urich had abandoned all pretense of diplomatic neutrality and was now watching Mira with the fascinated attention of someone witnessing a master craftsman demonstrate their art. The media representatives had stopped trying to provide running commentary and were simply recording what was clearly becoming a historic moment, though none of them yet understood the full significance of what they were documenting. 4 perfect shots, with 4 different weapons, each more challenging than the last, achieved with the effortless competence that separated true expertise from mere training. The transformation in the atmosphere was palpable, like the pressure change that preceded a thunderstorm rolling in from the Adriatic. What had begun as a routine military demonstration had evolved into something else entirely, a confrontation between assumptions and reality, between rank and skill, between what people expected to see and what was actually in front of them. The foreign commander's face had settled into the rigid mask of someone whose authority was being challenged in ways his training had never prepared him to handle, while his men clustered around him like sailors seeking shelter from a storm they hadn't seen coming. The Croatian personnel, meanwhile, were beginning to look at their long-time cleaning lady with entirely new eyes, as though she had just revealed herself to be someone they had never really known, despite working alongside her for years. Mira stood beside the weapons rack with the same calm demeanor she brought to her cleaning duties, apparently unaffected by the tension radiating from the Marines or the growing amazement of the Croatian soldiers. Her grey hair had escaped from its bun in places, giving her a slightly disheveled appearance that somehow made her marksmanship demonstration even more remarkable. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the heat was beginning to make everyone's uniforms stick uncomfortably to their skin, but nobody seemed willing to move or speak, as though breaking the silence might somehow undo what they had all witnessed. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its ancient bronze voice carrying across the water from Zadar's old town, marking time in a day that had already become unlike any other in the careers of everyone present. The silence stretched until Captain Urich stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of sudden understanding and deep respect. "Gospođo Kovačević," he said formally, using the Croatian title of respect that elevated her from invisible cleaning lady to someone worthy of recognition. "I think our guests deserve to know who they've been watching." His words fell into the tense air like stones into still water, creating ripples of anticipation that spread through both the Croatian and foreign personnel. Mira's weathered hands smoothed down her cleaning uniform with movements that seemed almost ceremonial, and for the first time since the demonstration began, her composed mask showed a crack of something deeper, memory perhaps, or the weight of years spent carrying secrets that nobody had bothered to ask about. Mira Kovacevic was a sniper in the Croatian army during the Homeland War, Captain Juric continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. She served on the Eastern Front, in Vukovar and Osijek, from 1991 to 1995. Her confirmed kills exceeded 200 enemy combatants, and she was awarded the Order of Nikola Shubit-Zrinski for exceptional bravery under fire. The numbers hung in the air like smoke, transforming everything that had come before from embarrassing accident to inevitable demonstration of expertise earned in the crucible of actual combat. The foreign Marines stood frozen, their earlier arrogance replaced by the stunned silence of people realizing they had been dismissing someone whose credentials were written in blood and sacrifice rather than training manuals and certification courses. The foreign commander's rigid posture crumbled as the full implications of what he had just learned settled into his consciousness like lead weights finding the bottom of a deep lake. His face cycled through several expressions: disbelief, embarrassment, and finally a grudging respect that fought against years of military hierarchy and ingrained assumptions about who belonged where in the carefully ordered world of professional soldiers. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice carrying none of its earlier authority and all of the uncertainty of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally reorganized. We had no idea. Your service record." He trailed off, apparently unable to find words adequate to address someone whose military experience made his own career seem like a training exercise by comparison. Mira looked at him with eyes that held no anger or triumph, just the patient weariness of someone who had long ago stopped expecting recognition for sacrifices that most people preferred not to think about. "You couldn't have known," she said simply, her English carrying the slight accent that marked her as someone who had learned the language out of necessity rather than choice. "As we say in Croatia, silent waters run deep. I clean your floors now because the war is over, and someone has to keep things tidy." Her words carried the weight of acceptance and pragmatism, the understanding that heroes didn't always get to remain heroes once the shooting stopped and the world moved on to other concerns. The young Marine who had earlier questioned her credentials stood with his mouth slightly open, his competitive shooting achievements suddenly seeming as significant as childhood games played in peaceful suburbs. The media representatives finally found their voices again, though their questions came in a rush of overlapping excitement, as they realized they had stumbled onto a story far bigger than a routine military exercise. Cameras flashed, and microphones appeared as though materialized from thin air, but Mira waved them away with the same gentle firmness she used to redirect people who walked through areas she had just mopped. "Please," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the journalistic enthusiasm. "I did my job then, and I do my job now. There's no story here except that some young men had a difficult day at the shooting range." Her deflection drew smiles from several of the Croatian veterans who recognized the dry humor that combat soldiers use to process experiences too large for ordinary emotions. The foreign Marines began to approach her individually, their earlier hostility replaced by the awkward respect of people trying to apologize for assumptions they couldn't take back, but could at least acknowledge. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been the most vocal in his dismissal of her abilities, stood in front of her for a long moment before extending his hand in the universal gesture of a soldier acknowledging another soldier. "Ma'am," he said simply, and the word carried more weight than any of his earlier speeches about training and qualifications. Mira shook his hand with the same matter-of-fact grace she brought to everything else, neither accepting his apology nor holding his earlier words against him, just acknowledging the gesture of respect between people who understood what it meant to hold a weapon in defense of something larger than themselves. If this story moved you or made you think, hit the like button and write in the comments what left the biggest impression on you. We want to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and see you in the next story. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Adriatic horizon, painting the ancient walls of Zadru in shades of gold and amber, the training ground slowly returned to its normal routine. The foreign Marines departed with a humility they hadn't arrived with, carrying a story they would tell for the rest of their careers about the day they learned that expertise came in forms they had never expected to encounter. Mira returned to her cleaning duties with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown, though now the Croatian personnel who passed her in the corridors met her eyes and nodded with the respect due to someone whose service had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Her mop moved across the floors with the same precision she had shown at the firing line, and her grey hair remained pulled back in its simple bun, but something fundamental had changed in the way people saw her, and perhaps in the way she saw herself. The weapons were cleaned and returned to storage, the targets were replaced, and the training ground was prepared for the next day's exercises, but the lesson of that morning would linger far longer than the echo of gunshots across the water. As one of the Croatian veterans remarked to his colleague while watching Mira work, "You never know what treasures are hidden in plain sight until someone gives them a chance to shine." The words carried across the evening air like the scent of salt and history, reminding everyone present that in Croatia, as everywhere else, the deepest waters often ran silent until the moment came for them to reveal their depth.